Okay, so Hussein, do you want to tell us, or Maher, or one of you? Bassam's going to be a bit late today. Um, just kind of briefly summarize what you know about Christian Wolff's moral philosophy. What struck you?
So basically, it's a moral philosophy that's based on the notion of perfection as an end aim, um, and and a consequence of this would be a pleasure, and we would be attaining pleasure and happiness. Um, it's based on the self, uh, in which the motivation of this philosophy is oneself, even in its relation to other selves. The core of this relation would be oneself perfection. So one would at the end work on his perfection as an end aim, and might make good for others, but this would be motivated from making good to himself.
Yeah, and of course there is a sticking point, a little bit of a difficulty, right? Because himself would say this is absolutely not selfish, because the rational person will know that their own perfection and the perfection of others are they're inextricably connected. So it's not,
Yes.
he would even probably say, it's not even as if I'm seeking my perfection through
Mm-hmm.
their perfection. You're manipulating what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm so Leibnizian. I've got this idea that the world is so interconnected that in a certain sense, there's no difference between my own
Yeah.
perfection and the perfection of the whole. But nevertheless, from
Mm-hmm.
our point of view, there does seem to be that tendency, right? He would also again say selfishness aims at one's own pleasure, whereas my ethical theory doesn't aim at pleasure at all, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, when he's telling you kind of in other contexts about why you should, want to be a good person, happiness figures very prominently, right?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to turn it into a motive.
Mm-hmm.
And some people might even say that happiness couldn't but be a motive, right? That
Mm-hmm.
even if you thought you were pursuing perfection, you would really be pursuing it for the sake of the pleasure that you would get out of it. This is what Crucius would say, for instance. Other things. So, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I I was thinking of this link between that a human being were given like the initial to grow internally to achieve perfection, and the idea um, of like reaching the stage where people develop their reason, become where at that stage they become the reason becomes master of the self.
Mm-hmm.
So which one comes before the other? So is it one would feel this striving to knowledge more and more when the reason becomes the master of the self, uh, or vice versa? So it's because of this feeling of striving to knowledge, one would go toward reaching the stage of the reason becoming master of the self. So and is for Wolf that the utmost rationality would be the perfection?
Um, well, the utmost rationality, the development of your reason is only part of your perfection, because it's your bodily perfection and other perfections of mind even. But
Mhm.
rationality would be that kind of the ruling perfection, right? The thing that kind of leads the way. By developing one's reason, one becomes more knowledgeable of all the other ways of achieving perfection, right?
Mhm.
As far as, I mean, for human beings, for Wolf, everybody's going to start out, well, start out, we're born, right? So we don't
Mhm.
have well-developed reason. We have a very, very underdeveloped intuition of the perfect, right? And so we're
Mhm.
not motivated towards the good. We're always motivated towards the good, but we're in great error when we're born. So we're going to always need a stage of punishment and reward imposed and taught by others. But once we reach a certain stage, yes, once you know what is perfect, obviously there's this kind of strange automatic, it sounds almost automatic in Wolf, right? Like when you perceive perfection, you then are motivated by that, right? Intuition
Mhm.
of perfection motivates us towards it. And so it kind of starts to generate its own internal propulsion towards what is towards greater and greater perfection, right? And then eh, what happens in that propulsion is we perceive perfection, we're motivated towards it, we thereby become more aware of it, our reason develops as a result, and we become capable of becoming even more aware of it. And there's this kind of, in principle, infinite progress that is instantiated, right? This is why there's possibly an afterlife and so on. It's a bit of a weird theory, is it not? It may sound like the kind of
Yes.
ethical theory that if someone came up with it, it wouldn't. Not many people would say that makes that agrees with our sense of what ethics is about. But yeah, this was the dominant ethical theory in all of philosophy for at least 100 years, right? In Germany before Kant. And you can see it, why this is the case, because of certain features of it that kind of really attach to other features of the modern Enlightenment period, right? The idea of progress, the idea that they want to get away from a sense of medieval Christian ethics, where it's all about obedience and being, you know, in Christian ethics, you're supposed to essentially make yourself into a very good slave, right? To God. You're supposed to be fully obedient. That's what ethics is about, pleasing God. And here, suddenly, you have someone who's teaching an ethics which is about becoming like God, right? Becoming your own master, taking control of yourself. And you know, Descartes would love this. This is very much Cartesian, I think. If you ever read Descartes and he talks about ethics, and you're like, what is he talking about? Because he believes his philosophy founds in ethics. But like, where is their ethical theory? Well, it's because he conceives of ethics as something like a kind of technique, right? That grows out of knowledge to improving the body, medicine, so on. And so a lot of things, everything, in a sense, ethics or moral philosophy becomes I mean, it's kind of like the ancients in a way, right? In a way, it goes back, it becomes more like Aristotle than Christian ethics was, because it's about becoming a kind of fully developed, thriving, growing, you know, even in Aristotle, becoming, you know, the good involves becoming something of an authority, right? Becoming a master of oneself and so on. So, same thing in Stoic ethics. So you can see there are a lot of ethical theories that kind of flow into Wolff, um, that, and also things of the period. The Stoicism was very, very much in revival at this time as well, because precisely people were in the same similar circumstance that made Stoicism so popular, which is Europe was in kind of hell, you know. During this period of time, it was torn by all these religious wars, and people wanted two things. They wanted some reason to live, hope of some kind, and they wanted some foundation for an ethical and social theory that wasn't dependent upon religion, so that you could build a neutral, neither Catholic nor Protestant, particular system, right? So you could have laws and they don't have to be founded in any particular sect of any religion. And this is where natural natural law theory kind of got its real impetus, right? It's why the people also, but not just Woolf, but others, thought this could be a framework for a kind of European society without, to emerge after the break between Catholicism and Protestantism. And Germany in particular, I don't know if you know the 30 Years' War and so on, but it completely destroyed Germany. A person who was living at the time said that after the 30 Years' War, which was in the just earlier, a little earlier than Wolf, that all that was left in Germany were corpses and prostitutes, because everybody had been killed and they were killing each other, and there was no social structure. There was just nothing left. There were no schools. People like Wolf and Thomasius, a little bit later, this is just before Wolf, time of Leibniz, Thomasius and Leibniz. There were, basically in whole parts of Germany, no universities whatsoever. Thomasius first founded the University of Halle in like a barn, right? Then they had a building with like 3 rooms. And then, this is how rudimentary things were at that time in Germany. So, in that light, Wolff's ethical theory makes a lot more sense, I think. But it's also interesting, and it's naturalist, right? Something to keep in mind. It's an attempt to found an ethical theory outside the confines of a religion, but he still tries to keep a possible continuity with religion, because Wolff is still Christian, right? So this is this idea that these laws of nature obligate themselves, and intrinsically the actions are good or bad. That's what that's all about. Why do they need to be intrinsically good or bad? To show that that you should desire them or not desire them, that they are obligatory, regardless of any other being outside of ourselves or those actions, right? Just the natural reason makes and teaches that these things are obligatory.
So you
But
mentioned,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. You mentioned that Kant would like the idea of the godlike instead of the obedience. But on the other side, we see that he did critique Wolff upon the notion of perfection as a motivation.
Yeah, sure.
But do we have any account, any Kantian account on perfection itself and its relation to this idea of infinite thing? So what is the Kantian view on this relation between perfection and the infinite and afterlife?
Yeah. So, okay, I'll say a few things relative to Wolff and Kant, just to show you how complicated all this ends up being. So when you read Kant, you will not find, when we read the Second Critique, you will find, I don't want to say you won't find at all, but I can't think of any real discussion of perfection whatsoever. If it does come up, it probably I know it does come up once in talking about Wolff, right? And then he debunks it as a possible basis for moral theory. But then you open up Kant's metaphysics of morals and go to the doctrine of virtue. And one of the fundamental divisions has to do with perfecting oneself, right? Seeking one's own perfection. Everybody will say that is part of virtue, is perfecting oneself. Now, what you mean by perfection and what's the ground of it, that's where they all disagree, right? Sometimes I feel like they're bickering over things that don't matter sometimes, because they're bickering over the foundations, and in a lot of ways they have the same ideas about what it looks like to be a good person, right? Helping your neighbor, not lying, these kinds of things kind of pan out to be more or less the same. That's not entirely true, but that does feel like it sometimes. So Kant's basic point, contrary to Wolff, is one that he's going to come to quite early, which is that the notion of perfection cannot serve two things. But the first one, the notion of perfection cannot serve as a foundation for moral theory, because the concept of perfection is purely formal. we already talked about this when I talked about Kant's pre-critical philosophy, right? The claim perfect yourself, Kant thinks, is not determinate enough to tell us what that perfection is. It's like the principle of non-contradiction. It tells us keep things that are true, right? But it doesn't tell you what is true. So here it doesn't tell you what is the ends. It only tells you to perfect yourself. Now Wolff is going to say that. So then Kant says, well, where would, in Wolff's theory, where would I find out what is that perfection, right? The content, the material of that command. Well, I could only do that scientifically. Yeah, of course, that's what Wolff intends, right? You study yourself to find out what makes you more perfect. Now, Kant says, Kant's response to that is, suddenly the end is something I have to discover empirically, right? So through empirical science, I have to discover what is actually perfect. And Kant's claim, as we're going to see, is that if I ever discover my end empirically, then the only way I can be motivated to pursue it is because it gives me pleasure empirically. And if that is the motive, then that conflicts with the very basis of what it means to perform an act that is of ethical or moral significance. So this brings us to that second point, which is in Wolff, all things, there's no real distinction between, I said dietetics, what you should eat, and moral theory, right? Like it's all about becoming more perfect. But in Hutcheson and in Crucius, we're going to see, they say, no, there's a fundamental distinction between moral goodness and prudence, between esteeming someone for moral reasons, being good, being bad, and being, unwise or being wise or being clever. These are fundamentally distinct things. If you accept that, and we're going to talk about that more if that doesn't fully register, then Kant's claim, the first claim I was making, leads to this idea that because Wolff's ethical theory is purely formal, we must discover its content empirically. Kant's further claim is we can only be motivated by what's empirically present to us, or we discover, if it generates in us a pleasure that is the motive for adopting it. Well, if that is, then Wolff's moral theory leads to a theory that is based upon a non-moral motive, which is the satisfaction of our desires. That's not what ethics is about. It's about doing what is right, regardless of whether it pleases you or not. So Kant's kind of criticism is going to come down to the idea that because Wolff's moral theory is purely formal, it ends up having to adopt its basis from empirical experience, and therefore what pleases us, and therefore is not moral. So it corrupts the genuine moral incentive. So that's going to be part of. On the other hand, Kant is going to talk a lot about in the groundwork, and he mentions it maybe in the second critique, autonomy and being a law to oneself, and reason. Right, reason is the source of the law. We have no master over us. We are our own masters in our conscience, and so on. This is very Kantian. So Kant is going to take a lot of positive things from Wolff. On the other hand, we're going to see that he's going to say that law has to be understood as a divine command, and that it offers punishment and reward. And he's going to start sounding like Crucius in certain parts of the second critique. And particularly what Kant says about happiness is going to be completely different from Wolff. It's going to be much more like Crucius, because, and here's the point, if ethics and morality is about something, it's about the rightfulness of something that is completely determined independently from what pleases me, right? The principle of becoming moral in Kant doesn't have any view, any direct view to what pleases me or what empirically would motivate me, then there is certainly the expectation that it's possible that becoming moral just makes me miserable, right? He doesn't have this idea of, he doesn't accept the idea that simply by becoming more virtuous, you're going to thereby, the byproduct is happiness. Because for one, you're not even seeking, for him, you're not seeking your own perfection. You're seeking to do what is right, regardless of anything else, right? There's some sacrifice that you have to make for ethics in Kant. And that sacrifice might be, and is, prioritizing your own happiness in any way. And so you have to think, well, the possibility is I'm going to do everything I'm supposed to and become ultimately miserable. And the people who don't do what they, the people who follow another principle, which is maybe Wolff's principle, or simply the principle of self-interest, may become perfectly happy, right? That's a rather odd situation where the virtuous are miserable and the vicious are happy. So there needs to be some kind of solution to that problem, right? We're going to see that's in the dialectic. But we'll see in Crucius the same thing. This problem wasn't invented by Kant. It's kind of something that grows out of all even modern ethical theories that are kind of more inspired by, I think, by religion, probably, right? Because what God commands you to do, there's that whole basis in Christianity of, Kierkegaard. You have to be willing to sacrifice your own child for God. Replace your own child with happiness. That was always the concern, right? Like, maybe for God, I just have to give up pursuing something that we all want. And ancient ethics always said was kind of the goal, which is happiness. But can we really accept a God that would allow, us to finally sacrifice our child at the end of the day? No, right? So God must be correcting it somehow, right? So that we'll find that in Kant as well, but we'll see it in Crucius. Okay, so good. You've now reached the level, each of you, of a sophomore in German university studies. You've studied a little bit of Wolff. Now, I was just going to tell you, I was telling you as we ended that, so there's this book by Baumgarten that Kant lectured from, and this is just a kind of an epitome. In some ways, Baumgarten is original, but in the foundations and all the stuff we've talked about, he's not particularly, he follows Wolff pretty closely there. And I was just going to go through, because I said that there was this discipline, right? This first or universal practical philosophy, right? Notice later this idea of a metaphysics of moral theory. That's not what they call it, but they call it, Baumgarten calls it first practical philosophy. So you could almost change that and put back in the Aristotelian language and say it's a metaphysics of practical philosophy, right? Suddenly you start to sound something like Kant, right? His first book on moral theory was the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, right? Then he has the critique of practical reason, and then he has the book called The Metaphysics of Morals, right? You could change that to say it's a first philosophy of morals. This whole idea, if you don't find it before Wolff, this is kind of a very significant innovation, right? This idea of a universal practical philosophy, because you couldn't have Kant's entire philosophical enterprise, where he has this in ethics, where he has a separate theoretical branch and then a first foundation of ethical theory that's separate, right? So that's kind of important, because to most people who study the history of philosophy, the very title of a book like The Groundwork of a Metaphysics of Morals sounds kind of like, where does that come from? That's just a weird combination of things, right? How can you have a metaphysics of morals? Was that metaphysics? If you read Aristotle, right? You say there's Nicomachean ethics and there's the metaphysics. what the hell is a metaphysics of morals? No one in an Aristotelian world, that was just nonsense, right? But this is where it comes from. And you can see some of the Wolffian elements here. So I'm just going to read just a very couple of paragraphs in the Prolegomena, right? So section 1, just as philosophy is the science of the qualities in things that are known without faith. So it doesn't means specifically religious faith, right? So philosophy is defined as a science of things that we can know without faith. Now, within philosophy, we're going to prove God's existence and so on, right? In metaphysics. But the basis of it is just reason, not faith. So too, in practical philosophy, the science of obligations of a person that are to be known without faith. So the ones that are known without faith, that's what makes up practical philosophy, right? The science of obligations. Now, so science is going to be very prominent. Practical philosophy is to be deduced by an apodictic method, so methodically using rational argumentation, as in Wolff, only through principles that are certain and not through testimonies, divine or human authorities or accounts. Again, not based upon any authorities, but based only on reason. It has certain goals about perfecting praxis and so on. Then the Prolegomena to universal practical philosophy. This was the Prolegomena to practical philosophy. First, universal practical philosophy is the science containing the first principles that are proper, but also common to the rest of the practical disciplines. What does that mean? It's a science of the first principles that belong to every practical science, every possible practical science, insofar as it's practical. They are common but proper to. He puts both of these there. To say something is proper to is to say, if X is a practical science, then as a practical science, these principles belong to it, right? So they are proper to it. International law is a practical science. So all the principles herein belong to the science of natural law or international law. But it's also common because there are multiple practical disciplines. So it's proper to each of them, right? But they all have this same common basis. Just as metaphysics is related to all the rest of the disciplines, so too is first practical philosophy related to the rest of the practical disciplines. So it's again, just this simple analogy between metaphysics. And then he just concludes there. So that's just what I wanted to show you here. So this, I guess, disciplinary categorization of Wolffian metaphysics. There's even a division in Kant's metaphysics of morals called First Universal Practical Philosophy. Okay, any questions before we talk about our last two authors here? No?
Professor, I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
So, while reading Wolff, it seems to me that it's a very individualistic act when he views morality and moral theory. Is there any reference to a societal form in Wolff's thought? Does the moral theory that Wolff suggests is embedded within a societal form, or it's just purely individualistic? Or did I miss something in between?
Yeah, I think you missed something just in that. So his claim would be self-perfection is interchangeable with the perfection of the world in which you live, right? This is just, he's thoroughly convinced of this. The world is a thoroughly interconnected, interdependent thing, such that the perfection of the individual and the perfection of society it's impossible to perfect oneself without perfecting one's society at the same time. And the other way around, perfecting one society perfects oneself. It looks maybe more individualistic because of this book is just the first beginning, and it will lead to his ethics in that book. But then he's got all these other books, right? He's got one about, I mean, already in the ethics, it's gonna very soon, there's a few things about duties to oneself, but then you're suddenly gonna have duties to your family and so on. And then there's a whole book about duties in society. And then there's the legal theory and so on, which is all about, I mean, even states and so on, right? So it's about the entire world, ultimately.
So,
And so he'd say, you're exactly wrong. Yes.
so in that sense, would the individual identity be totally dissolved within the collective identity of the group?
I think interchangeable is the way to think of it. So there's this kind of reciprocity in that. So this goes back to a kind of a fundamentally Leibnizian metaphysical idea, which is that all that an individual in a certain sense is one perspective on the whole. So if the whole is changed in any part, the individual is changed. And if the individual is changed in any part, the whole is changed, right? And these two things are interconnected in this kind of, this is one of the things they learn from, or one of the ideas that comes out of early modern science, that everything is interconnected by laws and rules, and you can't change this thing over here without this thing way over here being affected, right? And this is raised to the level of a kind of metaphysical proposition that the individual and the individual is a mirror of the whole. This is a kind of a revival of the microcosm, macrocosm idea, right? So yeah, people will argue, of course, with him whether that metaphysical claim really takes or has the ethical impact that it should, right? Because there will be lots of people that are arguing, well, no, this, yeah, this is true, so therefore you can just follow your own self-interest. That's not what Wolff thinks. He thinks as you learn more about what perfection is, you will become less self-interested, because self-interest is only a ignorance of what the true good is. That's what it comes from. And if you read someone like Alexander Pope, if y'all ever, you ever have a Saturday afternoon to read Kant's favorite poet, you can read Alexander Pope, and there's all this stuff in there about how as our knowledge of what the true good is, we rise from ourselves to kind of experience and identity with the whole of all things, right? And it's all about this system. Yeah.
It has actually one of my favorite poems of all time, Alexander Pope.
Is it love social? Self-love and social love end up being the same thing. There's a line in there. Anyways.
It says, how happy is the blameless vestal's lot? The world forgetting, but the world forgotten.
Well, when we get to Hutcheson, your Alexander Pope will come in handy there, because anyways. So turning to Crucius, Crucius is, I've told you about him essentially, but much closer to the Protestant thinkers of the time who were anti-Wolffians for the most part. You had these people who attacked Wolff for being a mechanist, right? His freedom is just the freedom of, as Kant will call it later, the freedom of a turnspit, right? The freedom of a machine, the freedom of a thing that can do, it's got some, it's not truly in control of itself. It's just able to do and to choose what pleases it. And what pleases it, it has no control over, right? Because it's pleased by the perception of perfection. So it's kind of like this, as Leibniz actually used this phrase, as spiritual automaton, right? Which is kind of a weird idea. Because everything has a sufficient reason. Remember, go back to that kind of rationalism. Freedom isn't not being an automaton. It's being an automaton that knows it's an automaton in a certain sense, right? And knows why, and has its reasoning as part of its automation. instead of being blindly automated by things it's unaware of, right? Um, so he was charged, as you know, and he was threatened with hanging, Wolf, for saying things that people interpreted. Now, those people that went to the king and said, "Hey, Wolf is saying things that are dangerous because he's teaching people they're not responsible for what they do and things like this," right? These people were generally very part of the group of not conservative, right? Newly inspired religious people who wanted to go back to a certain sense, back and finish what they thought Luther had started, right? A kind of religious revival within, in Protestantism. And so they didn't like, although Wolf is about, becoming a law to yourself, Wolf's philosophy is a very kind of rigid thing, right? Because it builds one system. There's no like freedom to have different views, which is something the Protestants really valued. This idea of eclecticism and each person coming up with their own judgment about things. But Wolf wants everybody to judge for themselves. But at the end of the day, like a lot of rationalists, like Descartes, if you judge for yourself properly, you believe exactly what I do necessarily, because that's the way the truth is, right? So like Descartes too was about judging for yourself, but if you disagreed with him, you were wrong and you had made a mistake, right? And you weren't thinking freely. If you thought freely, you'd think just like Descartes did. There's this thing that's going on in Wolf as well. And so in the university, Wolf kind of started to take over and say, well, if you want to teach religion, you've got to, you need reason. And so you got to read my books. And people didn't like this very much. That's the real reason they got upset with him, was because they felt like he was squashing freedom of thought at his university. And so they complained. But those people who complained were more or less religiously and otherwise motivated. They weren't philosophers. And then there was a group of philosophers who grew up trying to develop a philosophy that could kind of take the insights of those people, or at least the impressions and the tendencies, and turn them into a philosophical position, right? And argue with Wolf rather than having him hung, right? You could maybe actually write against Wolf and explain why Wolf is wrong. And there was this group of people led by a guy named Hoffman, and Crucius was the most famous one of the time of Kant's pre-critical period. He was one of the very most famous philosophers, and he's probably the philosopher that Kant studied more than anyone else. Although Kant was never a Crucian or a Wolfian. He was always quite independently minded. So here we'll just go through and you'll see what the differences here are. So remember, will, this is, I told you before, we talked about this, what a will is, right? Has to do with practical reason. Well, here, Crucius has a nice way of putting that, right? By a will, I understand the power of a mind to act according to its ideas, right? I mean that the will is the efficient cause, whereas the ideas are the model or the exemplary cause, right? So the will is an archetypally kind of teleological thing. It's causality, but it's causality determined by a representation, a purpose. The representation of what is to be produced by the act, right? So it's goal-oriented. Goal-oriented causality is what we call willing. So one acts according to them when one makes represented things real or tries to do so. My explanation includes everything that belongs to the will according to ordinary language. For desire and aversion, including all doing and omitting that come from them, are ascribed to will. In all these cases, it's clear that an act of the mind according to ideas comes first. There's a lot of stuff in Crucius that I'm going to skip because he has this idea, generally what's in a lot of these passages, is he believes that God had to create beings with wills, minds, and with freedom, most of all. He believes that it's necessary that free beings exist. The reasoning behind here is that he's got this idea that God's goal in creation could not be the creation of automatons. And why? Because nothing essential gets added. If I create a machine, there's nothing that justifies. So if you create a machine, right? Like the machine has to serve a purpose, doesn't it? Like if God were to create a machine, you would think that machine should serve a purpose. But if the machine that God created, creation were just a machine, then what could its purpose be? Well, if its purpose were inanimate things, to produce other inanimate things, then Christian says that doesn't make any sense. That would be in vain, because God doesn't need any inanimate things. God doesn't need anything, right? There's nothing inanimate that God doesn't have already, right? The only thing that God could possibly want in creating the world is to have something, to create something where he can receive recognition back from a being that it means something from, to be recognized. And if you create a computer that says, Eod creates a computer program that just flashes on the screen, I love Eod, right? This doesn't make sense because it's not free. It doesn't mean anything for it to do so because he's just made it do so. So Crucius is arguing that free beings are necessary in the world. God, in a certain sense, had to create, if he's going to create anything, had to create free beings, because only free beings and their ability, their freedom to acknowledge or not acknowledge their creator is the only thing God really can get that he can't give himself directly. So this is it's interesting, right? I don't imagine you're persuaded, but he's hitting on this idea that freedom, there's something about freedom that gives action value and significance, right? The same reason that we think that it matters what we do, saying, well, that's because we could not do it, right? That someone recognizes you and loves you matters at all because they could not do it. That freedom is a condition for anything having absolute value, right? Unconditional value. You'll notice, and he'll even talk about this, people being ends in themselves. Crucius will use this language, just as Kant uses this language, right? The only thing that makes the creation of a world worthwhile is that there's a being in it that is not a machine, that has this ability to accept or reject, love or not love, obey or not obey. So there's a lot of this in Crucius. He's going to argue, and I'm skipping that. I'm just kind of telling you globally that he's got a whole kind of background idea of that creation has to have free beings, that God had to create them, and that they, in order to be free beings, they have to have been given a lot of other things like the ability to know and the ability to will and so on, right?
So, Professor,
Yeah.
that's the difference between the automaton and the human, according to Crucius, in that sense. So, ability
Is freedom.
to be free, freedom, yes.
Yes. Freedom, not in Wolf's sense, because that would just be another machine. It would just be a machine that operates by way of ideas and pleasure and their connection, right? Kant will say a similar thing. We have to have a higher idea of freedom as undetermined by anything prior to it, right? As a first ground of determining oneself. Let's see. So he's going to... Go ahead.
The idea,
yeah.
So the idea of freedom here comes from God, or is it coming from the natural law, whether God exists or not?
So freedom here doesn't come from a law or anything. We're going to get to it because he's going to describe exactly what freedom is. But freedom is a fundamental capacity of the human soul, reducible to nothing else. It's kind of the very basis of, It's the very basis of what we would call personhood, or it's also therefore the basis of responsibility, it's the basis of the distinction between what is me and what is not me, what is mine. Now, we said Wolf, that was kind of true, right? In Wolf, it was what I have control over, right? But Crucius will argue what Wolf said is that you have control over your body and you have control over certain of your thoughts, but you don't have control over that control. That control itself is controlled by other things within you. And that's the way it is in Leibniz as well. Okay, so a little bit of terminology he goes through here. So what he calls an end, we understand by end only something that one wants consciously and with clear knowledge. So it's like a goal, right? So what the word end in these texts will mean. It's what we want consciously, and with clear knowledge. Whenever a mind strives for an end, three aspects are to be distinguished in the striving. This is only mildly useful for later, although it's actually quite important for Kant as well, we'll see. So there are three things that are distinguishable in striving towards an end or a goal. First of all, there must be an effective willing, which is the efficient power of moving toward something, right? I will call this the subjective end. Further, a particular thing must be conceived toward which one strives, which is called the objective end, right? Finally, and let's just outline those, the subjective end, the objective end. So one might call the first one kind of a drive towards something, right? That's the subjective end. The objective end is the thing towards which one is driven. Finally, we must think of a certain relation to that thing to the willing mind seeking to bring it about, and for the sake of which the action is undertaken, which is called the formal end. This is the important one. The other ones are obviously not so strange, right? If I desire, dinner is my objective end. My hunger for it is my subjective end, or to fulfill my hunger. But there's something else, this third thing, which he calls the formal end. That's rather strange. Let's read what he says. A certain relation of a thing to the willing mind, seeking to bring it about, and for the sake of which the action is undertaken. So a reason, a motive to undertake that action, which consists in the relationship of the object to the subject. That's what he calls the formal end. What does this mean? This means for Crucius, so first of all, I can desire the same thing, right? I can have the same objective end, but I can have different subjective ends, right? For the same objective end. And I can have different formal ends, different motives or reasons for why I pursue that end. Now, this is true in Wolff as well, but it's not at all clear. It's not something he talks much about at all. But it's going to be absolutely central to Kant, because Kant is going to say, you can lie and it can be a good thing, or you can lie and it can be a bad thing. Well, maybe not. Lying is a difficult one. You don't know, but you could perform an action that harms someone and it be morally esteemable because the formal end, the motive was esteemable, right? And Kant is going to say, actually, the morality of an action is judged always with reference not to the objective end, but to the formal end, right? For Wolff, he talks only about the objective end for the most part. He doesn't talk about why that it's important. We pursue perfection because we perceive it to be perfection. He doesn't give us any theory about, well, you might be pursuing perfection, but doing so for the wrong reasons, or doing it in a way that it reduces its moral significance or something. He doesn't talk about that. Anyways, so he gives an example here. When Alexander went to war against the Persians Empire was his objective end, right? To conquer it. The formal end was that he bring it under his control and rule it. to dominate it, right? That's a relationship between the Persian Empire and Alexander, right? It's a relation. But this is the reason he undertakes the objective end, right? In order to, Alexander's desire for mastery was the subjective end, right? So that could have been expressed in many different ways. Of course, the subjective end is in some way related to the formal end, right? But it's not quite clear how, but you could see how that might be related. Just going on, willing that one could omit or direct to something else, even in identical circumstances, is called a free willing, right? So here we have kind of a classic definition of freedom of indifference, right? The ability in identical circumstances to omit or direct ourselves to something else. That is what he means by freedom. By identical circumstances, he means identical physical, bodily circumstances and identical psychological circumstances, right? Internal and external, identically, to be able to do something or not to do it. That is what he calls freedom. So Buridan's ass had no problem. He should have just chosen which bale to eat, right? If he were free. Maybe he's not free, so then he's stuck. You all know the story of Buridan's ass, or at least the example given, right? Buridan's ass would work as a story for Wolff, right? Except Wolff and Leibniz, they have a solution to it. Does someone want to tell Mohammed what Buridan's ass is about? It's far less entertaining than it sounds. Anyone? Huria, Iyad, both of you nodded.
Okay, on one condition, I use the word donkey because I'm just gonna start tapping.
Okay.
There's a donkey and he's at a crossroad and he has two hay stacks on each side. So he's saying that all the conditions being equal, every reason pushing him to one side is equal to every reason pushing him to the other side. In that position, the donkey can still make a choice even if everything is equal. Like, well, psychologically, I don't know, path-wise, anything. If you're put in that situation, you can still make a choice. There's no one, even if there's no one inclining reason more than the other.
So the original example is supposed to, it's from a philosopher, Buridan, who was a late medieval philosopher. It's about whether there always has to be a ground for choosing between two things, right? That's in the things or in one's mind or something. So the idea is of a donkey, as Huria said, an ass, between two identical bales of hay. And the question is, will the ass starve to death because there's no reason to choose one rather than the other, right? Or will it, not? According to Leibniz, now, if you could have two identical bales of hay, right, and no preference for the ass, right? No like subtle psychological reason it prefers left to right or whatever, right? If they were truly identical, then for Leibniz, because of the principle of sufficient reason, the ass would have to starve to death, right? It would. Because everything that happens has a reason, and there's no reason in the bales of hay why one would be chosen rather than another. And Leibniz liked to use these examples, not Buridan's ass particularly, but he said, for instance, if nature had to create a triangle and what triangle would it create? So it would create a perfectly equilateral triangle, because it would be no reason to make one side shorter than another. So the only possible triangle that could be created is an equilateral triangle, right? Or he said, time can't be real, because if time were real, then every bit of time is identical to every other bit of time, right? So there would be no reason to put the world in time, in this time, rather than 3 seconds earlier or 10 minutes later, because it would be identical. The two cases would be identical. And so there's no, it's impossible for God to even choose such a thing, right? And so, because assuming time to be real would make it such that God could kind of, there would be this real container of time, and God could have kind of, could like shift the world around in it. But all these cases would be identical. He used this as an argument to say, well, time itself can't be such a thing, right? God couldn't make such a choice, but God did create the world. So he must have not been faced with such a choice. So this is the idea of Buridan's ass. According to Crucius, Buridan's ass, well, if it's us, even in those identical circumstances, freedom is what allows us to choose, with no ground determining us which one. So we could still just choose, right? That's what freedom is. And because we can do that with nothing in the bales telling us and determining us to choose, therefore, I mean, this is why our choice matters, right? Why it's our choice rather than being determined by the circumstance or by our psychological makeup or our chemical makeup or our genetics or whatever. It's what makes it ours. Okay, so, and the power involved is called freedom. So the power involved in freely willing is called freedom. The application freedom to freedom to an existing situation by which one really wills is called resolution or decision. The condition of our soul that arises, no, yeah, is there a question?
I have a question, though it's a bit not related. Is time in this sense considered as a linear progression of events?
In the Leibnizian example, time is an ordering. Well, that's what he says time is. But in the thought experiment, time would be some kind of real succession of moments in which each moment, and the reason it's, why would we be now rather than, oh, I don't know, I'd be saying now rather than 5 seconds from now. The reason there would be no difference there is because moments as such are all identical. Moments of time. And then they could either be filled with different events or not. Right? This was the idea that he was proposing, which he doesn't accept. Right? He doesn't accept that view of time because precisely it would violate the principle of sufficient reason.
Does Kant agree with this?
This doesn't really come up for Kant because he doesn't believe time is a real thing in the Leibnizian, in even the Leibnizian sense, right? But right, it's a form of sensibility and so on. It's not a metaphysical reality over and above events. But anyway, so Kant doesn't have a view. He thinks one shouldn't have a view on this thing, or that view of time is wrong. Okay. So the condition of our soul that arises with the satisfaction of willing is called the pleasant. So pleasure, we get pleasure when our will is satisfied, right? You're just getting this from psychology. Whatever accords with the will of a mind, we call to that extent good. Now this is very important. We get a definition of good, right? Good and evil. What was good and evil in Wolf?
Good is what pushes us towards perfection and harmony, right? And evil is what takes us out of the equation.
Okay. So you had this idea that we are motivated to pursue perfection, right? And that thing that we are obligated to do is what is good, and that which we are obligated not to do is evil, right? In other words, what we are motivated to do. So it ends up being that the good and the perfect are more or less the same thing, right? The good is the perfect insofar as the perfect is an object of our will, right? What makes it good is its perfection. right? But you just kind of slightly change the terminology there, and you say the perfect is just perfect, but the good is the kind of the perfect from the point of view of the will. That's what it is. It's the object of the will. Here, Crucius is saying good, the fitness goes the other way around. Something is called good because it accords with the will of a mind. So it's not that the good is defined by the perfect, right? It's the good is defined by being an object of a mind, right? So if there are no minds, there would be no good. That's probably true for Wolf as well, because there'd be no wills, right? But it's the mind that makes something good, right? It's the basis of its goodness, not perfection. So the will of a mind, whatever accords with the will of a mind, he makes it very general here, we call to that extent good. And likewise, so therefore, if there are different kinds of minds, there are different kinds of goods, right? And some minds are more important than others. See where this might go. God has a mind. There's a good defined and determined by God's will. There are things that I think are desirable for me, for my mind, and those are good for me, but they may not be the good that I ought to follow because God's goods are more important, right? What is contrary?
Then there is no evil, because
what is
everything
contrary
is
to that?
like, there is no evil.
Why no evil?
Because everything is derived from the will of a mind, and every one of us might, unless he's talking about one specific mind.
Okay,
If
so
this is the mind of God that he's referring to, then yeah, or
yeah. So he's starting off with it being completely general. This is what defines good, is the accord, the meaning of the word good is accord with the will of a mind, right? Now, that sounds relativistic, as you say, and so anything could be good or evil. Nothing is intrinsically good or evil, it would seem, right? Because it derives its goodness from the will of a mind. But again, he's not going to be a relativist because there's one mind that determines the true good, which is God's mind and God's will, right? That's going to be the basis of his ethical theory. The laws issue from the laws of ethical theory, morality, are the things that we must do in order to agree with the divine will. With what God determined to be good.
Then his ethical theory is based on the notion of obedience.
Yes.
Okay.
Obedience in an interesting way. And obedience is a kind of recognition and gratitude, but we'll see. Accordingly, the goodness of things consists in their relation, right? So things aren't intrinsically good. They're good because of a relation to the will with which they are compared. Just as truth rests in relation to the understanding. If by contrast we call something good that is in accord with perfection, if we talk like Wolf, he's referring to Wolf here, right? It is undeniable that this happens because rational minds generally desire perfection in themselves and in other things insofar as they desire it, as otherwise there would be no reason that one should not also call the imperfect good. The perfection of things consists only in their relation of its condition to the sum of the effects for which it is fit. And the more fit it is, and for the more fit it is for them, the more perfect it is. So goodness and perfection are not the same. So he's saying it's not a mistake that some people say that the good is perfection, but they've got it wrong. Many people desire perfection, wills desire perfection. So for many wills, perfection is good, but it's not perfection that determines what is good. It's the will, right? It just so happens that many wills also desire perfection because perfection has a relationship to power, as you see, for him. if a thing is more perfect, then it's possible and capable of producing more things. So in a certain sense, most people desire perfection because perfection makes them capable of desiring further things and more things, right? So in many cases, perfection and good will overlap, but this is about the relationship of what concept determines which other concept. And it's the mind of a will that determines what is good. And if the will of a mind determines that perfection is what it wants, then perfection becomes a good, right? But in themselves, goodness and perfection are not by definition the same. The morally good, however, is what is in accordance with the moral designs of God. That is, those that he wills to have forwarded through the reason and free wills of created minds. Or to put it otherwise, the morally good is what agrees with his laws. So again, this is the definition, right? So this is what the good is generally. It's what accords with the will of a mind. The morally good is what accords with the will of God's mind, God's divine will, right? That's what is the definition of the morally good. What's in accordance with God's moral designs. And so in seeking to obey, the laws, right? The laws of morality, or what Wolff called the natural laws, those laws are first conceived of as laws that God places on us by commanding us to pursue his and follow his will, right? So this is why it's sometimes called divine command theory, right? Now, how do we know what God's will is? That's another question, right? You might say, well, why is this not just this? This just sounds like a religious ethics. There's nothing. We're going to find actually Crucius doesn't. This is not based in religion, oddly, although structurally and theoretically, it's thoroughly religious in its intentions. But anyways, we'll get to that. You'll see that. It'll be somewhat surprising. So here, a little bit more on freedom. Freedom must be what makes us fit to be subordinated to a law and to obligation, and fit for giving a reckoning of the direction of our behavior, to take responsibility for, to give account for our actions. If we take together these presupposed properties, then a free being can be nothing but a being who at one time in one set of circumstances can either do or omit something, or in place of it do something else. The power by means of which it is capable of this is called freedom. This is nice because it kind of more deeply shows you the origin of this notion of freedom, right? You wouldn't just choose this notion of freedom for no reason. He believes this notion of freedom is a presupposition for the possibility of obligation genuinely understood, and the possibility of our taking account and being responsible for our own actions. That's exactly what some of these people who argued against Wolff said. Look, if you follow his ethical theory, you can basically throw up your hands and say, I'm a spiritual automaton. Why punish me, right? I was determined by my genetics, by my chemical makeup, by my circumstances. I could not have done otherwise, given all the circumstances. Their claim was, if this is the true theory, then Wolff, what you are doing, you may use the words obligation, you may use the words responsibility, you may use the words punishment and reward, but those words don't mean they cannot mean what they've always traditionally meant, right? You can't conceive of them properly. You have to reinterpret them as like Leibniz did and others, right? So you and I, when we think of punishment, we usually think of deserving. I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but don't we all have it? Like the person who does something knowingly, willingly, murders another person, they deserve the punishment. There's deserving there, right? And if they couldn't have done otherwise, we should not send them to jail. They were compelled, right? This is kind of our common sense ideas that are at the basis of even today in our understanding of what's going on in law courts and prisons, right? They deserve their punishment. Their punishment should be proportionate to what they did. They had to be responsible. They had to be free and in control of their acts, and so on. In someone like Leibniz or Wolff, they have to argue, well, in their theory, it doesn't really make sense that someone deserves punishment, right? Like they couldn't have done otherwise. So why do we punish still? And someone like Leibniz has to say, or Wolff, well, we punish to kind of retrain them, right? Think about what we read in Wolff. We punish to connect a motive. They can't see that it's bad for themselves to murder people, right? In their society. So we connect punishment with it by telling people, if you murder someone, you will be murdered in return. There's no desert there. We're doing it to dissuade them from murdering people. And so the point of punishment is not desert, it's kind of manipulation, right? Prevent them from doing it. Once they've done it, then you say, well, why once they've done it do we punish them? Because clearly the announced punishment of the laws didn't work on them. And they say, well, it's to give other people the example, right? Because obviously, why should you put someone to death if the whole idea of putting them to death was to motivate them not to do what they did, to then punish them and put them to death? And you say it's so that everybody sees that it's true, that punishment follows as a result of that action, right? That's a rather weird notion of punishment, right? Like you go to the guy you're about to put to death and say, sorry, I got to do this so that everybody else sees it. Instead, we feel much more comfortable to say, oh, you deserve it, right? Something you are responsible for that act, and so you need to have some kind of proportionate consequence. That's what Crucius is thinking about here, right? And without the notion of freedom, that doesn't make any sense. You have to think that you could have done otherwise. Yeah, Mohammed?
Sorry, I have an unrelated question, but I'm just wondering, would Wolff be pro-public punishment? So like public beheadings, for example, to show as to make it an example for society so that they learn for those who need to be taught? Well,
public executions were a fact of the world he lived in, right? Probably not. He probably wouldn't have been in favor of it for these reasons, right? Because now punishment, when you reconceive punishment in this way, then it's like punishing an animal, because these people who need punishment, they're like animals, right? They're not the rational man. He doesn't need it. He doesn't get involved in this stuff. Has no desire to murder people.
He calls them the beast, I think. Does he call them beasts?
He says like a beast, right? He says sometimes like a child.
So he does liken them, yeah.
Yeah. So from that point of view, this is the Enlightenment, right? So people are, one could use the same kind of argument and say, well, capital punishment doesn't really make sense, because the purpose of punishment suddenly is to dissuade people from performing acts. It's not desert. So it's not an eye for an eye, right? It can be, if it's, whatever it needs to keep you from taking an eye, right? It doesn't have to be your whole eye. It can be, a slap on the wrist if that will dissuade people from taking an eye. And the lesser, the better, right? The lesser, the better. And perhaps eventually you'll be like the Europeans, and you won't put people in jail hardly at all, compared to places like the United States that are driven by this kind of vengeance in the legal system, where you got people sentenced to 800 years in prison, right? Because that's what they deserve.
3 lifetimes.
Yeah. Many more. People have been sentenced to thousands of years in prison. That doesn't make any sense. But Anyways, clearly this idea of responsibility is so central to our, at least social sense of morality and so on. And this very clearly shows its connection with this notion of freedom as indifference. Okay, he goes on, he says, this is freedom. It's not to be without being determined by anything, either whether internal or external, right? You'd say Wolff's notion of freedom is just not being determined by anything external, but he admits internal determination, right? Because everything is determined in the Wolffian world, principle of sufficient reason. Obviously, someone like Crucius and others are also going to have books arguing that the principle of sufficient reason isn't a universal principle and so on, because they have to make sense of this notion of freedom, which conflicts with that principle. If one does not include this concept, there would never be an act done without necessity. So if one doesn't include freedom, then every action would be necessary. For even if one indicated an act to which the efficient substance were determined through its own ideas and desires, which one calls spontaneity or spiritual self-activity, still the act would not cease to be necessary, because everything determined, insofar as it is determined, is necessary. It makes no difference through what sort of ideas the affective mind is determined, not even whether or not the determining motive in its understanding are clearly conceived. So he's saying you're simply wrong, Leibniz and Wolff, that an act becomes free somehow simply because I'm aware of the reasons why I do it. Those reasons, if they're determining reasons, if they're reasons that make it such that I could not have performed the action, then no matter of being aware of them would matter, right? Unless that awareness can make a change in what I do. Otherwise, it's just observing the internal determination of oneself, right? And this, he likes to put it this way, that this makes virtue and vice luck. Did God give me a good nature or not? If not, I'm screwed. If he did, great. Should I be praised for that? Should I be blamed for that? It's all a matter of luck. In such cases, all our virtue would be turned into a mere piece of luck, as it would come about if one had a good nature or put in such relations to things that one were determined to do actions according with perfection. Vice would be mere misfortune, for which no true guilt could arise, and it would not be up to the agent to improve the situation, but everything would depend on the nature that the creator gave him, right? Then we could all stand back and say, God, why'd you make me this way? I could not do otherwise. Can't hold me responsible. God's ultimately responsible. Praise and blame sometimes mean only judgments about whether or not certain properties of a thing agree with perfection. Still, there are two sorts of praise and blame. And now we're going to hit on that distinction. He hits on that distinction here between moral and non-moral categories, right? Which in Wolff, there was no such distinction, right? So there are two sorts of praise and blame. The first is non-moral, which is nothing but a judgment of the perfection or imperfection of a thing. And the second, the moral, when we hold someone to be free, the free cause of a characteristic that we recognize as worthy of praise or blame, right? So there are two types of praise and blame. There's also, in a certain sense, he won't say two types of good, but one is just a natural thing, right? Just has to do with the perfection of something. Obviously, for Wolff, this distinction doesn't exist, but moral is different from that. That's when we hold a person, moral goods only apply to free beings, right? And it's when we recognize them as worthy in their conduct. Now, we'll see more about that. Let's see. More stuff about how free minds must exist. I'm just pointing to this because I said it's quite interesting from Kant's point of view, but that's a bit down the road for us, that without freedom, there would be no things that are intrinsically valuable, right? There would be no ends in themselves. He says here, finally, whoever admits the true divine law exists, whose certainty I will show in its place, must admit also on that account that there is true freedom in us because that is the sole possible cause that puts us in the condition to be subordinated to a law and to live according to it. Let's see what he says here. This is what I was referring to. For it is further necessary that free minds must exist in any world whatsoever. Otherwise, God would not create any world because he would have no end on his side in doing so. For otherwise, it would be as if God did everything himself and created beings would obtain through their reality no other relation to God than what they already had in the mere condition of possibility. Namely, that their being and essence depend on him. So he's saying, he puts a little more formally here. So we could possibly exist, right? A machine could possibly exist or whatever. Why would God make us actual or anything actual if it was only realizing what was already in that possibility? Everything would already be there in that possibility. They wouldn't gain anything by existing unless that being were a free being who, once it exists, could contribute in something of its own, right? That's the idea as he argues it here. He would therefore have had to make them real without the slightest formal end, what was the, if God were to make beings that were not free only, then these beings would have no relation to God different from what was there in their just being possible. And so he's saying God could have no motive, God could have no formal end. He uses this language here, right? Because there would be no relationship. When you create I think that's kind of a nice idea. One of the thing that freedom does is it creates a relationship back from the being that is free towards oneself, right? That freedom makes that being capable of responding, right? In a meaningful way, in a way that is not determined by the creator. And so that creates a relationship between creature and creator. Otherwise, there would be no relationship, right? If God just created inanimate things, there would be no relationship of the creation back to the creator. And so there would be no point of it being, and his technical language just means there would be no formal end, right? There would be no relationship there.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I have a question about this like concept of freedom making sense of morality. So if it's not inwardly affected nor externally affected, it seems like very arbitrary, like random. It comes from nowhere and you choose A. So if it doesn't stem from the character or things like this, it also has its own problem. It's not my argument. This is Hume's argument against freedom. So how would he respond to this?
I think like, so we can, I don't know if he has a good response to this. His best attempt at a response. So Bossum is just going to try to push the sufficient reason argument further, I guess, right? Like, what is this freedom determined by? It's determined by nothing. Right? Which kind of sums up that point of view. Because you're saying it has to be determined by something or I can't understand it. I want to understand why so-and-so does X or Y. And if you don't give me a determining reason as to why they did X rather than Y, then I don't really understand how it's possible for them to have done X rather than Y. They don't even understand perhaps why they did X rather than Y.
Yeah, it seems arbitrary, like, it doesn't it has a kind of problems to make sense of the moral thing,
Yeah, the question is what we really want, because we also don't like this idea of being a kind of spiritual automaton, because it kind of gets rid of the whole moral thing altogether, it seems. So Crucius makes a lot of attempts to understand. So clearly, how are we determined? He thinks there are already within us certain drives that push us in certain directions. What freedom does, so freedom is not like fully non-contextual. There are kind of options available to freedom always. But for him, you might say it's this way. Freedom is a first, he just wants to argue, you have to admit that there are somehow inexplicable things. Not everything can be explained. Not everything, there's eventually got to be a first somewhere in the chain of things, right? And he's just going to say, freedom is one of those first things. I can show that you're aware of your ability to do this. He argues from that point of view. I can argue from God's point of view that he had to create such beings. But I can't, it's freedom. This is often a problem with the concept of freedom, right? If it's freedom in this sense, that Kant himself will say, we have to admit this kind of freedom, or else we can't make sense of obligation and so on. Now, if you want an explanation of that freedom, Kant just says, we're at the end of the road. You hit the end of the road somewhere. Here we did. You can deny that you have such freedom.
But I'm not saying that we deny. I'm just saying, having this freedom, how does it make sense of morality? Because even if I assume that it exists, let's say it exists, such a freedom that exists, not internal or externally affected by anything.
Well,
it seems problematic. Even if that exists, we will have a problem with making sense of the right and the wrong, because it comes from nowhere, spontaneously, whatever, randomly, you choose it, but with no cause. If it's not caused by anything, nor external nor internal.
So the question is, it can be for Christians, it can be not determined by, it can be a response to certain things. Right, so freedom can choose to obey the divine law or whatever for the sake of obeying the divine law and no other reason whatsoever. Is it another way to, their idea is what it's going to make sense of in morality is the fact that you have to be, so the idea is when you act, you are the first cause of your act. Otherwise, you can't be held responsible for an act. So you would admit that in that respect, this notion of freedom is useful. You just think that it comes into a problem when it comes to the question of explaining psychologically the basis of that choice.
Yes, it's empty if it doesn't have any kind of character or anything kind of related.
Yeah.
It sounds empty.
So Crucius thinks we have all these drives. What freedom allows us to do is to select among the drives that we have. So it doesn't provide any content out of itself. I understand what your question is. I just don't know if there's I think this is probably why Kant, although he will defend a position kind of like this, will kind of turn it around, right? And say that question of an explanation, just kind of, this is what the critique of pure reason helps him avoid that problem by saying there's no solution to your problem. I understand your problem. There's no solution to it, but it can't have a solution. And we have to think of it the other way around, which is we are aware of the duty first, and we have to admit the freedom to make sense of the duty. But how we actually choose freely, that's some kind of metaphysical theory of freedom that I can't give you, right? So anyways, I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more later, but so this is what he says right here. Freedom consists in the inner perfect activity of the will, which is capable of connecting its efficacy with one of the currently activated drives of the will, or of omitting this connection and remaining inactive, or of connecting it with another drive instead of the first one. So freedom is kind of like this ability to, it doesn't create drives. It doesn't motivate us. We have to already have kind of naturally inbuilt motives or drives, sorry. And freedom allows us to kind of give preference to one or another, or to allow one to be active rather than another, right? And so it's a kind of way that you form and shape and train your drives, right? It's kind of it itself can't overcome and doesn't have power apart from its use of other drives to move you, right? So I can't by freedom of the will overcome drinking. I need to use my freedom to focus my consciousness on other drives and things and develop them within me so that they overcome and outweigh the desire to drink, right? So it's kind of a therapy, a forming of virtue and so on by manipulating one's own drives. For what has been said, we can easily see that the goal for whose sake God gave freedom to humans. It should be the ruling power that directs the powers of the soul, which are subordinated to and serve it. Through this, the capacities of the soul are transformed into abilities that can be ascribed to efficacious substances. Right? So through freedom, our inborn capacities become things of which we are in control, and then eventually the results of which we are responsible for, right? Let's go a bit faster here. Okay, so this is this issue about happiness. So when our desires are satisfied, pleasure ensues. We therefore desire pleasure because we want the satisfaction of our desires. If our desires are not satisfied, pain will ensue, which we therefore avoid. Thus, there arises out of all desires taken together a longing to see them satisfied with pleasure and to be free from all pain. And this is what we call the drive for happiness. So happiness, the drive for happiness is the drive to satisfy all of our other desires, right? Now, we have a desire to live and a desire for perfect assurance of the wanted object, whose satisfaction is also the aim of the drive for happiness. Consequently, the drive for happiness, taken comprehensively, is a drive for an endless life in which all our wishes will continually be pleasantly satisfied and in which no unhappiness is possible, right? Kant essentially uses the same definition of happiness in the second critique. It's not so different from Wolff's, except that Wolff's is based upon this notion of perfection, right? And pleasure being the byproduct of perfection. Now, we see from this that the drive towards happiness is in fact directed towards an infinite object, right? Because it's an endless life in which all are, this is what Kant will call an idea. This is this idea of a maximum. So Crucius defines here happiness not just as like being happy at this moment, but as a maximum of pleasure maximized in every way, endlessly, right? Continuous, and so on, having all these features of being maximal. So our happiness is in fact towards a drive towards an infinite object, right? That is toward one that will infinitely satisfy. Now, because the achievement of this is not possible except through the will and power of our Creator, it is clear that the drive to happiness is always an error if man strives for his happiness in any other order other than that in which he seeks to make himself pleasing to his Creator in every part and is assured of grace. Thus, the drive to human happiness, rightly understood, always leads to God. We'll find something similar in Kant, right? In fact, even God, the part of God here, this is how God is going to come into Kant's moral theory. Because ultimately, the desire for happiness will be the desire for something that we cannot assure ourselves. So the only way happiness is possible is if it's granted to us in a supernatural way through our becoming pleasing to our creators. Do you like that idea, Huria?
Professor?
Or Maher, yeah?
I wanna ask something. I'm just okay. First, does Crucius have the same idea as Leibniz when it comes to God in terms of moral necessity? I know he doesn't use the word, but I'm trying to figure out where the hell the two parted off when it comes to perfection and freedom. But I want to know what's his definition of God exactly. Is God morally necessitated to create individuals that have freedom, or
Yes.
is it something? Okay.
God is necessitated to create free beings, yes.
Okay, you said necessitated, but is he morally necessitated, or is Crucius also flirting with the necessity, as in between absolutely necessitated or morally?
I believe he even says absolutely necessitated. But you'd have to look in the metaphysics for that. I think even here he says somewhere that he has a rather strange. I mean, by absolute necessity, he does mean through a will, so that they might end up being more or less equivalent to moral necessity. But Maher, you had a question?
Yes. My question is evil outside God?
Is it outside God? Evil is anything that conflicts with the carrying out of God's will.
But God, as the omnipotent,
Yeah.
created both good and evil, right? So I could arguably say that a path down evil would also necessitate God's will.
No.
So
No, so this is the other reason that freedom is in a certain sense has to be there. Evil only arises through the disobedience to the divine will. That disobedience being made possible by freedom. So God, by creating free beings, didn't create evil, but he did create the possibility of evil.
but it's still within the realm of God.
Sure,
It's
but he
not
didn't create
outside
it.
the realm of God.
It doesn't exist until we do it, right? The primary thing that's evil here is human action. If it conflicts with the divine intention, right?
So by us creating evil, this goes against the realm of God. It goes against
Yes.
the divine will.
Yes.
So basically, we're creating an entity which is outside God's will,
Yes.
or which is contradictory to the omnipotency of God.
No, I mean, I don't think Crucius thinks so, because he thinks that God chose to create free beings. In fact, it's the fact, right? This is again goes to this idea that what would be the value of beings obeying God's will if those beings necessarily obeyed God's will? The only, in a way, for Crucius, the only way that our obeying God's will can be a good thing, to have significance, is if we have the ability not to. That has to be there. That potential not to do it.
Yes, that I understand. I'm just like the always leads to God kind of part, and I'm just arguing that in the sense of understanding what God is in that perspective, that you could arguably say that evil can lead to God in the same way.
How could
So I'm
evil
just
lead to
negate
God?
through saying that God has the realm of everything, which is good and evil in that sense. So God like asks us or necessitates us to, or gave us the freedom to choose between two things.
Yeah.
But in terms of the path leading towards, it could be the other way around.
You mean that what is called good could have been evil? Is this what you're?
Yeah.
Yes, if God had willed something else for us, but then what was evil always would have been evil, and what was good always would have been good, right? I mean, this is only a thought idea, right? Like, because I mean, all you're really recognizing is that for Crucius, good is not an intrinsic thing; it's dependent on the will of a mind. That's what he told us. Right? So the fact that this is good rather than evil depends on God's laws, or not on
But
God's
that even
laws, but on
but
God's.
but that even necessitates a certain set of boundaries for the will of the mind, right? So the will of the mind is actually acting within a specific set of boundaries and not in total freedom, because uh, some people would have their will of the mind take them to do evil acts. So it's not really an application of the will of the mind in that way, but rather a subset of the will of the mind that is constrained by X, Y, and Z.
Okay, maybe we can talk about this, or you can send me an email, and I can, because I
Sure.
don't quite understand the last thing you said, but maybe we're talking past each other a little bit. So let's get through this. So conscience here, he's going to talk about conscience. We talked about that in Wolf. We call the judgment of morality of our acts conscience. So we shall call the basic drive to recognize the divine moral law, that is its ground in it, that is its ground, the drive of conscience. The conscience is no mere theoretical judgment of the understanding, so contrary to Wolf, but must have its ground in a drive of the will, can be seen from the fact that it rejoices us and terrifies us. One should not confuse conscience with consciousness in general, or with the awareness of the perfection or imperfection in one's actions in general. For it is one thing to make something a matter of conscience, another to be aware of imperfection in action, and therefore to regret that one did what one did because one is aware that it is contrary to one's goal. So here a couple of things. He wants to distinguish conscience as what Wolf called it, which is this kind of rationality about what is perfect and imperfect and the rules leading to it, from what is generally conscience. Conscience having to do with something that is, as he says, it's connected with fear, right? It's connected with guilt. It's connected with an emotional investment that motivates us. It's a kind of drive within us. Conscience just isn't just a judgment that something is perfect or imperfect. It's a condemnation. It's this is how conscience motivates. And this relates to the fact that there is a fundamental distinction between judging something to be imperfect and judging something to be wrong. These are two different things. One says that a thing is not useful. The other says that it's bad. These are two distinct things, Wolf. You can't say that they are one and the same. And in the same way that good and bad differ from perfect and imperfect, or smart or not smart, right? A person can do something, according to Crucius or Hutcheson, as we'll see, that is not at all prudent, right? But is good. This is fundamentally what, a distinction that we have. And in the same way, conscience should be distinguished from calculating means to ends, right? These two things should be different. The motive of conscience is therefore merely a motive to recognize a certain indebtedness. This word Schuldigkeiten it's related to guilt, responsibility. Schuld means, often is translated in German as guilt, guiltiness, right? But it comes originally from the idea that you owe something. So it's translated here as indebtedness. When you are guilty, it means you feel like you are responsible for something. You should have done something else. You owed it to someone else to have done something else. There's a kind of, you see the connection with indebtedness there. So conscience is about indebtedness. that is such universal obligations, and this is the German word for obligation, is Verbindlichkeit, which has the root here verbinden, which means to be bound, right? Like tied to something. So an obligation is something you are bound to, right? Something where you recognize that you are in debt. Notice this language is very similar to what I was talking about with like desert, right? If you do something wrong, you have to pay. This language of punishment and so on. You have a guilt is related to debt, right? You have to repay your debt by serving time in jail or whatever. This is what conscience is about for Crucius. And it's not only that, but it's obligation as one must observe, even if one does not wish to consider the advantages and disadvantages arising from them. So when we talk about indebtedness and obligation, these things are independent of advantage and disadvantage, right? Perfection or imperfection. And so on. Okay, he continues to argue, about this distinction between the, naturally disadvantageous or advantageous, perfect and imperfect, and the obligated or the not obligated, right? We distinguish what lays an indebtedness on us from motives in general. If we are inclined towards something through motives or are even fully determined to do it, it still does not follow on that account that we have an indebtedness to do it. For there are also our motives for evil and for indifferent things. So this is a reflection back on Wolff. He's always got Wolff in mind here. Wolff, if you say that an obligation, right, something to which I'm indebted to it because there's a motive attached to it. Remember, that was Wolff's definition of indebted or of obligation. It's something to which a motive is attached, to do it or not to do it. And Crucius is just saying, like with a lot of Leibnizian, philosophy, you are redefining terms in ways that don't agree with how people use them. That we have motives for evil things. Do you say we have an obligation, therefore, to do evil? Because you defined obligation as the thing for which there is a motive, right? We have motivations to do things that are morally indifferent. We have motivations to eat, well. Maybe you're right, Wolff, but that's morally indifferent. No one is going to, if you don't eat if you don't eat well, you don't have a bad conscience. You don't feel obligation or indebtedness or guilt, right? The moral belongs to that realm, not to the realm of advantage, perfection, imperfection, and so on. So what you can kind of see here is that Crucius has a different, I don't know how to even, I've been thinking about it for a long time, but people like Crucius and Hutcheson, they have the sense that morality belongs to a special realm that does not perfectly overlap with the advantageous or the perfect or the natural. That morality is something beside the natural. And Crucius is in a certain sense trying to make sense of that, right? Say, well, how is it that we have these distinctions? There's this fundamental line that runs through things that divides the realm of reason and prudence and being clever from being good, moral, worthy, or evil, and so on. What's the basis of this distinction, right? And trying to make sense of it. And in Crucius, obviously, the distinction is going to be that the moral is defined by God's will for us, right? That's going to be, and the notion of obligation is obligation to God. And so he's going to bring in God and all of these things to make sense of all those features of debt and so on. Kant's going to want them as well. right? He's going to keep that distinction, but he's going to try to introduce those things in a different way. Further, indebtedness is to be distinguished from all inner and outer compulsions. So obligation is different from inner or outer compulsion, but for Wolff, those just were inner and outer compulsion. For whatever we are compelled to do, we have on that account no indebtedness to do. So he's going to say something, this sounds very much like Kant later, to say, if we are compelled to do something, then then it makes no sense for us to be obligated to do it. The very notion of obligation presupposes that we're not compelled or determined to do something. This is again Crucius's idea, or the general idea, that built into the idea of being bound by a law to do to do something. The very notion of law presupposes the possibility of doing otherwise, right? Something's going on in my throat here. We distinguish indebtedness further from what one does out of fear or hope. For how much one does one do from fear to which one is not obligated? And how often do we say that this or that would be for our own benefit, but it is also our indebtedness? So again, drawing attention to this distinction between what's for our own benefit, what we might do from fear, from what we are actually morally obligated to do. Obligation is not compulsion. Going to skip that for sake of time. Okay, so here, Crucius, this is an interesting distinction that he makes, and an interesting move that he makes. So I said we'll come to the, ultimately then, the question, if this is the framework of Crucius's moral theory, then the question is, how do we come to know the will of God, right? Should we know it through revelation? Should we know it through reason? What? And Crucius argues that, so this is where he's kind of, I said it's a bit surprising, because you'd say, well, insofar as everything he said, it sounds very religious. So why doesn't he just go on and say that we learn the will of God from from biblical texts, right? But Crucius is trying, just like Wolff, to build a religiously neutral, ethical, moral theory, right? So he argues there must be some way, God doesn't reveal to everyone equally on the planet the same things. So there must be a natural path. God must have given us a shorter way to know what his will is, such that even if you were, never brought up in a certain religious tradition, or maybe it was lacking, that you would always know what was right and wrong. God must teach his will directly to the individual. Notice this is also very closely related to Protestantism, the idea that we have an inner relationship to God, right? But this is not a religious relationship in a normal sense. It's not through prayer or anything. It's through our natural capacities. So he argues that there must be in the human being a natural knowledge of the divine will present in conscience. So it must be available to us naturally without religion. So in a certain sense, like Wolff, there's going to be a basis in nature, in our own nature, though, for knowing what is morally right and wrong, even though that is something that stems ultimately from God, right? There will be a purely natural basis. So because all men are subordinated to the divine law and will be judged by it hereafter, it is easy to infer that God would create a shorter path to knowledge of it and would make his will evident in such a way that it could come to everyone's knowledge. Experience agrees with this. All men recognize certain things as right or wrong, proper or improper, under which words nothing but a dark idea of a universal law lies buried. So we have a natural capacity called conscience, right? A natural awareness of what the divine law requires of us. Notice this does make a distinction with Wolff, right? Because Wolff's natural law was something you discover through science. And so it wasn't equally available to everyone. You need to build up your rational, logical abilities, right? You need to study logic and science and so on, and undertake experiments to figure out what exactly increases human perfection. But here, Crucius it has nothing to do with it. It's still based in reason, natural reason, but it's an immediate knowledge of what is right and wrong without any kind of scientific investigation of that, right? This we'll see is very much like Kant, right? That we all have a kind of sense of what is right and wrong, under which there lies a universal law that we're not even aware of. This sounds very, very Kantian, actually, because there's something Kant calls a moral sense, the moral incentive, which is a sense of right and wrong. But underlying it, it's based upon the moral law, an awareness of the moral law. So a man of moderate understanding will soon become aware that in the hardest and most confused actions of what would be right or wrong, even without being able to give clearly any sufficient grounds for his judgment or to defend it. From this, it is evident that there is a natural sensation of justice and propriety in us, and that has something more than a mere judgment of the understanding as its ground. This same, as I said, the same idea will be found. It sounds a lot like Hutcheson, as you'll see. There's kind of a natural sense for what is right and wrong, and of the distinction between right and wrong and useful or not useful. One thing that's important here that we'll find in Kant is that whereas in Wolff you could do bad things because of ignorance. In fact, that's the only reason you do bad things, because once you know what is right, you do what is right. In Kant is going to make the point that in morality, there's a fundamental idea that we always must be capable of knowing what is right and wrong. Morality is not about discovering what is right and wrong. The point of morality is willing in accordance with what is right and wrong, choosing what is right over what is wrong. That's the fundamental problem of moral life, not discovering what is right and wrong. And so there's this whole kind of a central part of the way Kant thinks about morality is that each person not only knows, but can do what is right and wrong in every given circumstance. Okay, I guess it's, what is it, 3:30, so we still have some time. This leads, okay, leads him to lay out his moral principle. Remember, Wolff's moral principle had to do with doing what makes yourself and others more perfect. His is do what is in accordance with the perfection of God and your relations to him, and further what accords with the essential perfection of human nature and omit the opposite. So this is obviously the major distinction, right? Following what's what leads to or is in accord with the perfection of God, which is in accordance with God's will, right? This is the foundation of his moral theory. You might say if he had a simplified version, it would be obey or do what is God's will, and omit the opposite. Of course, God wills our perfection as well. So Wolff is kind of right in a way that we should pursue our own perfection, but not because of the reason Wolff gives, but rather because God wills our perfection, right? Now, also in accordance with what he said above, so there's this natural source of right and wrong, but he says there's also a way for philosophers to find out what is right and wrong and to discover that universal law. How do they discover that universal law? They discover it through metaphysics and through understanding the divine nature, because you can derive necessarily, according to a philosophical knowledge of the divine will, what the divine will must will, right? And what if you can do that, then you can determine through reason what is right and wrong, because you can determine what is in accordance with God's will by understanding the divine will. But he's not confident that everyone needs or would be able to do that. So there must also be this natural sensation or drive, right, towards what is right or wrong. So the drive of conscience is a natural, basic drive that moves us to do what conforms with divine and human perfection out of obedience to God's will because of our dependence on him. Let's see what else is useful here. All of this stuff, so what he's talked about as duty and morally right. A duty in the broad sense is an act or a mission in which a moral necessity exists. A moral necessity doesn't mean that you are necessitated to do something. It means that you ought to do it. That's what's meant by moral necessity here. Kant's going to use a similar term, moral necessity. A moral necessity is a relation of an act or a mission to certain ends such that a rational mind can understand that it should or should not be done, right? So an obligation expresses a moral necessity to do something. But it doesn't mean it has to happen. It means it ought to happen. The condition in which moral necessity for something exists in a broad sense is called obligation. I'm obliged to do it. I'm bound to do it. Accordingly, morals encompass duties and obligations. Now, he separately defines prudence, right? Prudence, we understand the skill of choosing and applying good means to one's ends. This notion of prudence is very similar to what Wolff called the moral, right? Morally good. Choosing and applying good means to one's ends. Virtue, however, is the agreement of the moral condition of the mind with the divine laws. So here we see kind of codified that fundamental distinction between prudence. He's going to call what Wolff called, pursuing one's own perfection, prudence, right? And distinguishing it from virtue. Virtue is this agreement of the mind with the divine laws. That's what virtue is. Now, as in accordance with what he said above, obviously these two can overlap, right? It can be a virtue to act prudently if it's God's will that you act prudently, right? But it becomes prudence becomes moral because God willed that you be prudent, right? Just as perfection becomes a good because of the relationship to a will, right? It's the same structure there. Yeah, there's a basis of a distinction there between different kinds of obligation based upon whether it's obligation to an end that's made morally necessary by God, then it's a moral obligation, or it can be obligation in a state, or it can be an obligation by a parent. You have different forms of obligation depending on whose will is imposing that. We can see that true moral dependence differs from merely overwhelming power of one over another, and thus that the difference is between a superior whose will has an obligating power and a more powerful being who can compel to fulfillment of his wish. For example, a highwayman can compel us to give him our money, but no obligation to do so follows from his will, which by contrast does not take place with a true lawgiver. For we have to thank a lawgiver for certain goods, which come merely from his will because he has no superior over him. So not only does our benefit bid us obey him in order not to lose goods, and also our perfection, because resistance would be in vain, which together make an obligation of prudence, but also because the drive of conscience, we feel an indebtedness to obedience and naturally approve it, from which a legal obligation arises. So here he's distinguishing, again, of course he has Wolf in mind, but he's saying, look, an obligation is not based upon the connecting with an action a motive, right? Because equally, a highwayman, a person who hijacks you on the road, right, forces you to do certain things. They connect a punishment with not obeying their will, right? But from that does not arise any obligation for you to obey their will. He's claiming that on Wolf's grounds there would, because that's the notion of obligation. Says no, obligation actually only comes about in one special circumstance. It's not simply because a will connects a motive. Obligation comes about only when, as it were, so he says, when we would get something good from the person who is obligating us. Someone to whom we owe something. Not because they're giving us something good is the motive for us to do it. Does anyone have any idea what he's talking about here? It's gotten a little bit complicated. Mohammed, do you want to try?
Honestly, I'm confused.
What?
I don't know honestly how to explain.
Okay. So we are only obligated. So the notion of obligation he has, we're only obligated to someone if we owe them something. That's the notion of indebtedness, right? It's built into the idea that, so don't just think of it as a case where like, so let's say I harm someone, another person who hasn't harmed me, right? In a certain sense, I owe them because they are fellow human beings. Maybe they are, intrinsic value or whatever. I owe them something, right? I owe them my respect. I owe them my recognition. Now, when you owe something like that to someone, when someone deserves something, that's the basis of obligation. You don't have obligation just because someone motivates you to do something. I don't owe anything to a robber. So therefore, I cannot be indebted to the robber. The only reason I can be indebted to God is because I owe something to God. So you can only, the notion of indebtedness and of obligation, they sound like something imposed on us, right? They sounds very tyrannical. God makes us follow his will. But Crucius is saying, but I don't owe anything to God unless I obey his will because he deserves to be obeyed. If God were like a robber or a highwayman forcing me to do these things, to obey his will out of force or fear, then I would have no true obligation. Obligation, again, you see, he's kind of doing a kind of philosophical analysis of really what's meant by obligation. What are the presuppositions of the concept of obligation? And to be obligated, just 1 second, to be obligated for him clearly requires the sense of indebtedness. I'm in debt to someone. I'm indebted to my creator because everything good comes from my creator. So you can say, God does give me good things, but that's not why I should obey God. I should obey God out of the gratitude that is owed to someone who rewards and gives good things, right? Okay, yes, was it Maher?
Yes. So Is this irrespective of the concepts of heaven and hell, reward and punishment?
I mean, that is, I mean, yeah, obviously these are related. He doesn't say anything here about heaven and hell because this is not supposed to be based directly on religion, right? It's supposed to be an analysis of kind of the sense of morality that we all have within us, right? In our awareness of our obligations, and simply a kind of philosophical analysis of what's contained in and presupposed by that sense of obligation, and of what is right and wrong. Now, yes, obviously in religion that's going to be connected with heaven and hell and so on, but it's going to be connected in a critical way, right? So Crucius is going to say there may be the idea of hell, but the idea of hell cannot be there to put us into fear, right? Heaven can't be there to give us the idea of a reward as a motive. We're not supposed to be motivated by rewards and punishments, because that suddenly makes it a matter of prudence, right? If I obeyed God's will in order to... No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The whole premise of religion, starts with reward and punishment. If you don't do so, then you'll be subject to hell and tormenting, and the whole process. So in a way, arguably, I could go in and say that it exists in the same form as the robber.
No, and this is why Crucius, as a modern Enlightenment thinker, does not like that idea, right? He's going to accept. He has to accept, as in the religious text, there's heaven and hell. But like Leibniz, like others, like Wolff, in this respect, like them, he's going to argue that cannot be, the purpose of heaven and hell cannot be to provide a motive. Now, it might be in Wolff for the childlike, the beast-like, but not for the rational man, right? And in Crucius, it's not, it can't either, because he's got this distinction. That's part of the point of this distinction between prudence and morality, right? And morality having to do with doing God's will out of obedience and a sense of obligation, that you owe it to God. Now, if I do it, it's exactly a similar case. If I did it because I think of God as a robber or as a tyrant, then I am actually acting out of prudence. I'm saying to myself, if I don't do what this man wants me to do, he's going to hurt me. So a way to avoid the pain is to do what they want. That's prudence. That's why he wants to make that distinction. See, but that's not moral. That can't be moral. There has to be something else going on, and that's this idea of deserving, right? I don't look at God as a robber. I look at God as a being to whom I owe my obedience, that deserves my obedience. And when I act from that, now you can add heaven and hell on top of it for other reasons, right? So he's going to say, where does heaven come from? Well, to obey God's will, and he's going to say this a little bit later, in the world, it doesn't look like obeying God's, God, if God were a robber, he'd be a really bad one. Because the people who don't obey him, he rewards on earth, right? The evil people get the good stuff. The bad people get the bad stuff. So he's sending mixed signals, this robber. But that's why God will ultimately fix the balance in the end, right? That's what heaven and hell comes from, is the idea that God will eventually set all that right, because it couldn't be that God intended us to follow his will and then become miserable. But that seems to be how the world might work. So this must only be a part of something greater going on. Yeah.
So going back to deservability, the deservability comes from because God created us, then we are indebted,
Yeah,
or
and
we
because
are.
from God we get all good things that we get. All good things come from God, right? He's a benevolent being with a good will towards us. And so he deserves, yes, our obedience. Yeah. So even so, even so, everything we've said, I said this to Haria a little bit earlier, God's will is necessary. This is going to be, you got to read his metaphysics to see where he's going to argue this. And so the morally good is not arbitrary. So the example that you and I were talking about, Maher, that although it is true that good things are not intrinsically good, they depend upon a will that desires them, and in this case, the divine will. There are certain things that the divine will necessarily wills. And so those things are necessarily, so it's more complicated even than that, right? Like it's more of a impossibility for the evil to be good than you even thought, right? Because although it's not intrinsically impossible for it to have been good, God couldn't have willed otherwise, although it does depend on his will. That's not a particularly important point. So obedience to God should be our unconditionally highest subjective end. What a rational being does in conformity with the essential perfection of things becomes virtue only when it is done out of obedience. So again, it's that formal end. It's that relationship of ourselves contained in obedience and our feeling of indebtedness. That's what makes something become virtue, right? So even following the will of God doesn't make us virtuous unless we follow the will of God with the right formal end, with the right motive, which is obedience and a sense of indebtedness. So you could live just like the good person out of prudence, look just like them if you were smart, right? But think of God as a robber. Yes?
I have a question. Would guilt that stems from indebtedness be considered as morally good, as a motive? So if I'm doing things because I feel guilty, I feel indebted, is this within my moral nature? Is this good by itself?
Yeah.
Or is my drive for action to be moral separated from guilt? Because I have a hard time separating indebtedness from guilt.
Well, I mean, the word, unfortunately, so this is just a bit of language here. In English, the word guilt is used. So these German terms, Schuldigkeit, it can be translated as guilt, as guiltiness, as indebtedness, as owing something. It doesn't mean that you've committed a crime, right? That's what we connect with the idea of guilt, that I'm somehow a criminal. I've done something wrong. No, that's not required for this notion of Schuld. So you are not acting out of that. Even if you did something that you thought was bad and you tried to correct it somehow, the only way that would be virtuous is if you did that out of a sense that you were rightfully in the wrong, right? You really should not have done it, that the person deserved you to have done something else. And so you tried to make up for that. That makes it virtuous for the first time, right? So it's very important that the motive there is the key to the virtuousness and distinguishing the virtuous from the pragmatic. This is the last point. So God's main goal in this life is virtue. So God's main thing is not for us to achieve his will, but for us to recognize his will and to attempt to follow it because of our sense of obligation to God, right? For in any world there must be free acts. Further, God necessarily wills that these be directed in accordance with virtue, upon which reward and punishment follows. Because of this goodness, however, God wants rational minds to be happy. God wants us to be happy, right? These assertions fit together only if God first puts rational minds in the world in conditions in which they can exercise free virtue, and afterwards distributes happiness in proportionate to virtue. So the way these ideas can fit together, God wants us to be happy, but the condition of happiness is virtue. Virtue is the main goal of God. It's for us to recognize his indebtedness. And then, since happiness is not naturally connected with such virtue, God is, because of his will, is able to distribute then happiness in proportion to virtue. And this is this idea. Happiness in this life cannot be God's goal. Virtue must be his goal. For the arrangement of the world is quite unsuited to this end. This is just a central contention that Kant has as well. If you are a naturalist, if you look at the world and you say, try to read off from the world what mankind's purpose is, and you believe there's a creator, then you cannot be an Aristotelian, because happiness just doesn't seem to be man's lot, right? Nothing seems to really direct us in nature. And if you were just to take the evidence of nature and say, does nature intend human beings to be happy? And God created nature, so we're saying through nature, what do you think God intends to be the purpose of human life? Crucius and Kant both think that you might be more inclined to think God intended us to suffer than to be happy. So happiness cannot be, is just empirically not what God is seeking in the world. What he must be seeking in the world is this kind of virtue, right? And then happiness is up to God to distribute. Okay, that's what I want to talk about with Crucius. There's a bit more, but it's not super important. I'm not gonna. I figure I'm not going to go through particularly Hutcheson. I think the fundamental ideas in Hutcheson are a lot of. It's a bit of a different take on this idea that Crucius has, that we must have a natural sense. So there's main idea that Kant gets out of Hutcheson is, so if you think about Kant's kind of development. Early on, he kind of broke with this moral theory of Wolff for these reasons that I said, that he thinks that Wolff's moral theory is too formal and doesn't give us a good enough sense of what exactly we ought to do. Crucius kind of gives a little bit there by saying there's this natural sense we have, conscience, that everyone has. That's where you find out what the will of God is. But still, you must note in the text, it's very vague what exactly is going on there. Well, Hutcheson and the British tradition, they too, for different reasons, would not accept a Wolffian moral theory. Their basic reason was reason itself is not a source of ends at all. It cannot be. This is where I said your Alexander Pope will come in handy. Pope, if you remember in Alexander, any of you read Alexander Pope, you remember that in Pope there's two principles that govern human nature: passion and reason. Reason calculates, but passion directs and motivates. This is a kind of an idea that runs all throughout Hume, Scottish moral theory, Locke, others, which is that what reason does is, once you have an end, Reason helps you calculate the means to that end. But to adopt an end in the first place, to be motivated to adopt an end as your end, is not something reason is capable of doing. It has to be directed by something else, right? Propelled by something else. So for instance, reason doesn't tell me what I want to eat. Once I have a drive to eat a warm meal at dinner time, then I can use my reason to figure out how to get that, right? Reason shows the path to it, but it doesn't determine the will towards its end. This is just they think this is a fundamental feature of reason. Because reason always needs more reasons, right? And if I give you any end, you can always ask, why do you adopt that end, right? Why should I desire a warm meal, right? I say you should desire a warm meal because you want to be healthy. Why should I be healthy? Reason needs an answer, right? Well, eventually they say either we adopt no ends, or at some point we just have to say, because I want a warm meal, because I want to be happy. I have to stop reason at some point and say, I just have a fundamental drive towards this, right? And so they think of, as in Pope, that there are these two features, passion that drives and reason that kind of directs and rationalizes passion to pursue its goal in more rational ways. So in the same way, they're saying, Hutchison will adopt this and others and say, well, there must be some fundamental, otherwise inexplicable, first motive to do certain things, right? And if there is morality, if there's a basis for morality, and that there are some things that are better than others that we know we should do, then for those things, there must be such fundamental original motives, right? Well, where are these motives present, and how do we understand them? Well, Hutchison says, we just have to locate them, just like Crucius said. They just have to be present in our minds. And what I will do as a philosopher is I will point them out to you and analyze them. The sense. So he says, putting it more formally, if reason can't tell us what is right and wrong by its very nature, we must have a sense of what is right and wrong. What is the idea of a sense there? It's the idea of an immediate perception that is not based on reason. It's immediate. So it doesn't give any reasons. It motivates, right? It gives an immediate indication of good or bad. And that is like a sense, they say, just like flavor or whatever. It's the same kind of thing, although we don't have an organ for it. It's just, we're aware of it. Hutchison compares it to beauty. He says you're aware of certain forms, right? Structures, shapes, trees, flowers. Some of them immediately give you pleasure. We call it beauty. Others do not. There's a similar thing when we look at moral actions and immoral actions. When we look at actions of human beings, there's a beauty and an ugliness to actions that is like the beauty and ugliness of objects. This is the moral sense we're talking about. And this is where morality, the foundation of morality lies. It lies in this kind of, now, when you analyze that, when you read Hutchison, which you've all read, you'll see in there, fundamentally what he's trying to do is show that if we follow that sense of our moral sense, we can look at examples, right, of, for instance, people who are very perfect and very clever and wise and intelligent, and we notice that we don't approve them in the same way that we approve people who are morally good or esteemed, right? There's a fundamental distinction in the sense that we have. And this also could have been used and was used by Kant at the time as a criticism of Wolff. Look, the more we don't approve as morally good. So think of like praise and blame. If someone fails at writing a computer program, right? They clearly lack a perfection. But that's completely different from them lying, for instance, right? So clearly there's a difference between natural perfections and capacities and moral qualities. Also, morality is not based upon advantage, it seems, because many people do things for us that help us and we don't esteem them, right? We don't praise them. So he says, you might have a moral feeling of love and affection and approval for someone you've never met who you heard a story about. They saved the life of a child, right? Didn't benefit you in any way, but you have a sense of the moral goodness of that character. On the other hand, you might discover in your backyard a treasure, right? That was buried centuries ago, and you open up the treasure box and you're suddenly rich. That person's done more for you than any other person, and yet you don't ascribe to them any kind of moral value, right? There's a fundamental distinction between these kinds of judgments. And they're kind of saying that there's nothing more fundamental than this. This is just a fundamental distinction that we make. This is the basis of virtue. Where did this come from? Hutcheson thinks it comes from God. God arranged that we have such things, but that's not really necessary to understand his moral theory, because this sense is based in us, right? Now, what is and I'll finish up pretty quickly here. What is what is it that we sense? So that's the first step, is to say there is a moral sense. It's absolute. It's the basis of what we call obligation and a sense of right and wrong. It's how we know what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. But the question then is, what does it actually approve and disapprove? If we want to know what we should do, then we should know what that sense judges to be good and what it judges to be bad, right? And what is that? For Hutcheson, his claim is that we always find that feature of actions that always is the basis of that approval is the sense that the person who is acting is striving to do good and be benevolent. That's the fundamental thing that we sense in actions that makes us approve of them. So what does that mean? So you start with this notion of moral sense, and then based upon an analysis of what it approves and the conditions of what it approves, he extracts the idea of what we should do to be approved, right? We should strive to be benevolent. In other words, to help other people and to strive for the good of others. In other words, we need to be kind of utilitarians, right? We need to strive for the happiness of the whole. But his ethical theory is not utilitarian, right? Because the good is determined by the moral sense. It just so happens that the moral sense approves of those who strive for the happiness of the greatest number of people, right? So Hume has a similar idea because they can't be utilitarians, because the motive can't be the good of the most people, right? The motive has to be the moral sense, right, of what is right and wrong. And it just so happens that what the moral sense approves is one who seeks to do the most good for the most people, right? And so you may not, it's not consequentialist either, because in utilitarian ethics, the goodness of an act is determined by the consequences, the degree of the good of the consequences, right? In Hutcheson, the good of the act is determined by the intention to do the good for the most people, regardless of what the outcome is. Of course, you want to be intelligent and smart about, and that's part of being moral, is trying to rationally, maximize, if someone does something and they intend the good for the most people, but they did a really crappy job at it, right? They brought about great misery because they were stupid in the way they didn't apply their reason properly to try to actually maximize happiness. Then they could be blamed for that, right? But because their motive was imperfect, not because of what the consequence was, but because they weren't fully devoted to actually doing it right. So in that respect, they weren't really motivated to bring about the most happiness for the most people, because they neglected the true means to do so, right? But if you intended the greatest happiness for the greatest people and a bunch of people ended up dying, in Hutcheson's view, you still did an immorally esteemable act because it's about the motive, right? So in some ways, this is very much like Crucius minus all of the superimposed theological framework. And Kant, in his pre-critical work, loved to mix these together. So he thought actually Crucius had kind of given the form, the structure of an ethical theory, but he thought that the real analysis of the good and evil was the cutting edge analysis was found in Hutcheson, through all of the kind of examples he gives and the kind of, now there are some fundamental differences, obviously, right? Like the moral sense is the same. There's a moral sense in both, but Crucius thinks that underlying that moral sense is a universal law, which Hutcheson doesn't talk about at all, right? Also, Crucius thinks that that fundamental sense is about obedience and about indebtedness, whereas for Hutcheson, it's about benevolence in other people's actions. Benevolence as a motive. So that's very different in a certain sense, right? Both, however, and this is the last point, both really are fundamental to framing for Kant this distinction between a naturalistic ethics and some other ethics that tries to do justice to the concept of freedom, obligation, even indebtedness, punishment, and so on. So although Kant is often held up as like the ultimate philosopher of autonomy, and so he sounds very much like Wolff in this respect, a man is a law to himself, we're going to see in the second half of the Critique of Practical Reason that Kant says you also must think of that God as authored, as well as legislated by God. And we have to think of rewards and punishments and all of these things. And so in the second half of in the first half of the second critique, we're going to see he sounds a lot like Wolff in some respects and Hutcheson. And in the second part, he's going to sound a lot like Crucius, because he's still going to make room for these ideas, this whole theological framework. I think this is very important because this is the last thing I'll say. I'll let you guys go. When you're involved in Kant's ethical theory, it's so complicated that it's only afterwards that you kind of step back. I mean, after years sometimes, but this is kind of putting it in the foreground for you, that Kant has a certain moral outlook, right, that he shares with, say, Hutcheson and Crucius. And I don't know exactly why, right? There's something fundamentally that shapes the way he thinks about ethics. Part of this being this distinction between the prudence and virtue that is not explained in his theory, right? He gives a framework for it. He gives a philosophical, system that makes sense of it. But if you don't share, if you're someone like Wolff, probably if you read Kant's ethical theory, you're not going to be persuaded if you truly do have this kind of fundamentally different sense of what ethics is all about, right? I think you could just as well read Kant and say, what is all this stuff about, obligation and so on? This is not what ethics is about at all. Maybe this only belongs to a Christian worldview in which people they think that you have to have this idea of maybe all these distinctions we make between the moral and the prudent are not, these are just based upon, this Christian or religious idea of obedience to a divine being and so on. And they're not necessary parts of morality, right? Possibly. is there anything truly wrong with thinking of human beings as maybe becoming masters rather than always, but for Kant, we're always going to not be masters, right? He thinks of the moral law as something that humiliates human beings. He uses that word. Of course, you don't want to overread that, but there's a strong sense in which, for Kant, morality is not of our whole selves, right? It's opposed to our desires and our natural aspects. Fundamentally, there's an opposition. They will never be, like Wolf thought, one where happiness and pleasure and everything goes together with being virtuous, right? They're fundamentally different, distinct things. Okay, so I guess I'll see you all. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you all next week.
Professor,
Yeah.
I have some questions on Hutchison. Shall I send you an email with those?
Okay.
Okay.
Anyone else can leave if they want. I'll talk to Maher. So what's your question?
All right. So basically, after reading like Hutchison and understanding that Hutchison also relates to the theological aspect. So from a Hutchison perspective,
Yeah.
if we wake up and discover that God doesn't exist, would we still think that morality is encoded in us or not?
Yes. I mean, this is part of the other thing that when we get to Kant's moral theory. If you know any of Kant's moral theory, you'll know that one of his senses about morality is that it immediately. This is the idea of categorical. He calls the moral law categorical imperative. Iyad, you've come back to us. Were you always here, or you've disappeared off my screen?
Yeah, I just had
Oh, okay. Sorry.
yeah, I just had some connection trouble.
I see. So the moral ought is something that's unconditional. He'll say it's not hypothetical. It doesn't say if you want to do X, you should do Y, right? It says do X, period. So it has this immediacy of its commands. This is one of the things that I think he really saw in Hutchison that is not as evident in Crucius, which is that through the idea of a moral sense is the idea of this immediacy of the approval or disapproval, right? So the moral theory has this. It doesn't say you will like this if you do this or something. No, it's like a sense. It's like a brute thing that when you sense it, it's bad. When you sense it, it's good, right? It's an immediate awareness. And so this goes to your question. The sense of right and wrong in no way depends upon a knowledge or a belief in God. It's built into us as a fundamental reaction, like a sense, right? We cannot but have it. Just as if you see an ugly building, you are not free to decide whether you see it as beautiful or ugly, or you taste something, whether you like it or not, right? You cannot choose. There's this unconditionality of it. So if it turned out we stopped believing in God, and this is for Hutchison, this is a virtue. You don't need to believe in God to follow his moral theory. In fact, this is quite interesting because for all three of them, they have that desire to think that there's a basis in us for knowing right and wrong that's independent of religion. Even if ultimately, as Hutchison was quite religious. Although he takes a lot of this stuff from Shaftesbury, who was even more of a deist, if you know what that means, right? So kind of a rational religion rather than Christian religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my second question goes to in the top of the page 520, he speaks about obligation, and if you can just if you can go over the top part, the first few lines and that, and just
520.
I had trouble understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see what I can do. Obligation, yeah.
Yes,
Um,
obligation, exactly.
if anyone asks, can we have any sense of obligation abstracting from the laws of a superior? We must answer according to the various senses of the word obligation. If by obligation we understand a determination without regard to our own interest to approve actions and to perform them, which determination shall also make us displeased with ourselves and uneasy upon having acted contrary to it. In this meaning of the word obligation, there is naturally an obligation upon all men to benevolence. And they are still under its influence, even when by false or partial opinions of the natural tendency of their actions, this moral sense leads them to evil. So this is exactly this idea, right? If you mean by obligation that we have, without regard to our interests, so not prudence, right? So this is like Crucius in this respect. He's going to say, by obligation, I don't mean my own interest is not involved, right? This is the other thing that Kant really gets and absorbs into his thought, which is that fundamental to moral action is being disinterested, not based on interest. That as soon as interest enters, morality ceases. So without my own interest, which determination should also make us displeased with ourselves and uneasy. So he's just referring here to the moral sense. He's saying, if you mean, do I have, even without knowledge of a God or a divine law or anything, I have within me a ground that determines me to approve and perform certain actions simply out of a sense of their goodness or badness, then I say yes. Then I have an obligation. Even without God, I have an obligation, right? Because what do I have? I have a moral sense, right? So I have something that when I sense it in others, I feel displeasure and I don't approve them. I feel disapproval. When I sense them positively, right, morally good things, I have a sense that approves them. And in myself, when I perform certain actions, I am unhappy with myself. I disapprove myself. In this way, Hutcheson also connects, in a way that Kant does, some aspect of morality with happiness. Because as naturally happy as you may be, you still, if you are immoral, you will never be content with yourself. You will always inwardly disapprove. This he shares with Hutcheson perfectly well, right? So he calls this contentment. And so you can never be happy if you're immoral, never fully, perfectly happy, even though you may get a lot of great stuff. Now, whether this is Kant's own wish fulfillment and our own, right? Because as soon as whenever we see someone who we believe is evil and getting away with it, we say, well, they must at least be unhappy with themselves, right? This also goes back in an odd way to Plato, right? If you go back to Plato's Republic, the idea that the evil person may gain all the external benefits, but their soul is not at rest with itself, not at harmony with itself. And so they can never truly be happy without being also virtuous. A similar idea, very similar idea. Except on an entirely different basis, obviously, because it's on the basis of this notion of an immediate moral sense. Was there more there, or was that?
Yes, I have one more question. It's related to when he discusses the axioms to complete a universal rule for moral actions.
Yeah.
And in particular to the sixth axiom, I didn't understand how that can be a blueprint of action rather than a statement. So I think that would be on page. It's on page 515.
515. The sixth axiom here?
Yes.
Okay, let me read it. Here we must also observe that every moral agent justly considers himself as part of this rational system, which may be useful to the whole, so that he may be in part an object of his own benevolence. Nay, farther, as was hinted above, he may see that the preservation of the system requires everyone to be innocently solicitous about himself. Hence, he may conclude that an action which brings greater evil to the agent than good to the others, however, it may evidence strong benevolence or a virtuous disposition in the agent, yet it must be founded upon a mistaken opinion of this tendency. So, interestingly, this is an idea that I think it originates out of Shaftesbury, but also it's found in Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, similar idea, which is that here just what Hutcheson is saying is, so we are kind of like Wolff was saying, we're all interconnected in a system, in a great system. And so our own happiness, but not for Wolff, it was perfection. But here, our own happiness and the happiness of society are connected, right? So intending, and we need to understand that connection properly. And if we do understand that connection properly, we will understand that each individual's primary thing, a condition for making other people happy, is making yourself happy. And when you make others happy, you can also indirectly make yourself happy. So these things are connected. But there's this fundamental thing he's saying at the bottom, which is what Kant says in a sense. So Kant has this duty to benevolence in the Metaphysics of Morals. And he says, but there's a fundamental limit to benevolence. Like, I can't give away all my money. I shouldn't give away all my money, right? Why? Because I lose the ability to do more good by making myself miserable. It's not good for society if we all bankrupt ourselves helping others, right? That you got a lot of, so this is the idea. It puts a limit, there's a balance. I'm part of the whole, I'm supposed to make the whole happy, but I don't have a direct, interestingly, I don't have a direct duty to my own happiness, right? Self-interest is not a good thing for Hutcheson, right? But I might recognize kind of, oh, I'm so smart that I realize as much as I would like to help others and make myself wretched, that's not the smart way to bring about others' happiness either. So kind of, I indirectly am benevolent to myself, not directly.
Got it. One last thing off topic.
Yeah.
I felt while reading Hutcheson and talking about feelings, I felt that this is a precursor of the German Romanticism happening there. Am I correct in making the link, or this is totally not the case?
How so?
Because the importance of feelings, the importance of passion and getting to knowledge on a very simplistic level of German Romanticism.
Yeah,
I might be totally off on this side.
I'm trying to think of if there's anything there. Well, very, very tenuous, very tenuous. There would be a closer connection with, like, so in Kant's pre-critical period, he kind of mixes together three different thinkers: Crucius, who clearly has nothing to do with well, actually in a way with Romanticism, Hutcheson and Rousseau. Because if you read Rousseau's Emile, in one part of it, he talks a little bit about moral theory, and he also talks about a sentiment. It's very much about sentiment, right? Only relationship to Romanticism is that in Romanticism you kind of they looked to some of these earlier figures for criticisms of reason, rationality as being a sufficient basis. And so in Hutcheson you find that somewhat, right? You find that more so in Rousseau. And Romanticism, oddly enough, I don't know if this has been clear to you, but a lot of strands of Romanticism actually end up being more religious and more conservative religious. They kind of look back before the Enlightenment to certain things. And so in this way, someone like Crucius actually, there's a through from him to things like some of the figures that brought about Romanticism, but still it's quite tenuous. It might be interesting what if there's something deeper there, but I'm not so sure of it. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Sure.
so much.
Yeah, good. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thanks. Bye.